I'm Corel Painter Master Rutten, and in this tutorial, I'll show you how to paint an apple. I'm using a canvas that is 8 inches by 8 inches at 300 pixels per inch, and I'm going to have it automatically create a new layer for me. I'll use this layer for my sketch. I'll create an additional layer beneath it. I'll make sure Preserve Transparency is not enabled, and I'll fill it with a light gray. This will be used temporarily to make it easier for you to see what I'm doing, so it's entirely optional. I'll select the sketch layer and use the sketching pencil and a dark gray color to sketch with. Let's also open the completed apple painting in the reference image panel so we have a reference to follow. I'll start with a tall oval shape and then flatten the sides and create dents at the top and bottom. Next, I'll use the eraser to clean up the lines that I don't want. I'll also indicate where to place the stem. During the composition phase, you can use guides, rulers, the layout grid, divine proportion, mirror painting, and perspective guides to help you draw each element and compose your scene. For example, I could draw a grid on a separate layer to help with the proportions of the apple, or I can draw guides to help find the angles and the center of the apple. If I want to adjust part of the sketch, I can do that. I'll make a selection of the stem and then float it to reposition it. You can also cut parts of a layer and then transform them. If you like, you can create additional layers of sketches to refine this shape, but this is a fairly simple drawing, so I'll move on. You may also want to distort your sketch rather than redrawing it. Sometimes that is more efficient. I'll use a large distorto brush at a low strength to nudge the apple sketch around. In order to see the sketch while painting, you may want to darken it by duplicating the sketch several times, then merge those layers with Ctrl-E. You may also want to set the composite method of the sketch to multiply so that it blends with layers that are underneath it. Once you are satisfied with your sketch, it's time to block in shapes with paint. It can be helpful to create a few layers ahead of time to help you visualize the order of the primary objects in your scene. In this case, I'll create layers beneath the sketch for the apple and the stem. I'll add additional layers as needed throughout the painting process. Next, I'll select the smooth scratchboard brush and a dark red color, a cooler red that's a little bit darker than the mid-tone, but not quite the darkest red color. I'll select the apple layer, disable Preserve Transparency, and I'll paint right along the edge of my sketch. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect because we can adjust the edges of the paint later. Once I've created a closed shape, I'll switch to my paint bucket with K. I'll reset the paint bucket tool, and then I'll click to fill in the center. Next, I'll select the pinch brush, and with a medium-sized brush, I'll paint along the edge of the apple. It will be easier to see what I'm doing if I change the composite method of the sketch to multiply and reduce the opacity of the layer. A larger brush with longer strokes will create smoother curves. You can stray away from the sketch if it looks better. I'll bring this into the exact shape that I want, because once I start shading, it will become more difficult to change the shape of the apple. I think that's a pretty good apple shape. Now let's fill in the stem layer the same way. This time I'll choose a bright blue color that I can see against the red. It doesn't have to be the final color because I can change that later. I'll fill it in with the smooth scratchboard, and then I'll erase the bottom where it is overlapped by the apple. Now if I want to change the color of the stem, I'll enable Preserve Transparency, choose a brown color, and fill. Before you commit, you can hunt around for the exact color that you want. I'll turn off Preserve Transparency and use the pinch brush to clean up the stem shape. And now we have a basic silhouette of the stem and the apple. Because I can use Preserve Transparency to isolate these shapes from the background, I don't ever need to modify these edges again, so I can focus on only adding form to the apple. Let's start by adding some three-dimensional form to the apple layer. I'll enable Preserve Transparency and select the digital airbrush. Then I'll sample my base color and make it a bit brighter while shifting the hue toward orange ever so slightly. With a large brush, I'll create a gradient that emanates from the top left where the light is hitting the apple. Next, I'll create a new layer for a highlight and disable Preserve Transparency. I'll make my brush smaller and select white. I'll use that to better define the location of the primary light source in the top left. I'll make my brush even smaller and make the center of the light brighter. I'll make the highlight kind of squarish and make a few speckles surrounding it so the surface looks textured. You can use pin pressure to limit the opacity of this brush to make the highlight look like it's glowing. It can be helpful to use the navigator panel to preview your artwork at a smaller scale while you are working. This will help you better evaluate the effect of what you are painting. Since the highlight is on its own layer, I can move it around to get it just right. Now our apple is starting to come together. Let's select the apple layer and turn Preserve Transparency back on. I'll add some darker colors now by sampling my darkest red and making it a bit darker. With a small digital airbrush, I'll paint along the bottom edges of the apple. This makes it look like there's a bit of a shadow underneath. I'm painting with the edge of the brush to create a gradient. I'll also add a bit of a shadow to the top of the apple and opposite the light. Next, I will make a dent in the top of the apple. I'll create a new layer for that called Dent, and I'll disable Preserve Transparency. I'll adjust the opacity of the sketch so I can see what I'm doing. I'll make a selection of the apple, then I'll subtract from it with the lasso tool to isolate the area to be dented in. Then I will use the edge of the digital airbrush to make a gradient that sinks into the dent. I'll deselect that selection. To enhance the realism of the apple, I'll want to add in some other colors like orange and yellow. I'll create a separate layer beneath the dent, and I'll name it Color. In order to keep the paint trapped within the apple shape, I'll need to use the Select Layer Content command on the apple layer. Now I can paint on a blank layer without it spilling onto the background. I'm using the digital airbrush, and you'll notice my colors are subdued a bit so they blend in naturally. I'll add a brighter red spot to the top left as well. The apple is starting to look three-dimensional, but it also needs some environment color reflected onto it to make it look shiny. In this scene, the walls and floor will be white, so that's what I will reflect onto the apple. I'll create a separate layer called Reflection, and I'll paint white along the top, bottom, and sides of the apple where the surface curves away. The reflections will be thinner, sharper, and duller on the top of the apple, so I'll use a smaller brush with gray to put those in. At this point, I have added enough paint to indicate everything in my sketch, so I can hide or delete that. I'll also deselect my active selection. Let's add some shading to the stem layer next. I'll zoom into it and enable Preserve Transparency. The stem is a cylinder, so the same lighting principles I used on the sphere will apply, but the gradients will run vertically along the length of the shape. I'll sample the brown color and make it darker. Then I'll paint mostly on the opposite side to the light source. Next, I'll make my base color lighter, and with a smaller brush, I will add lighter browns and even a hint of yellow-orange near the tip. I'll use white to add a soft and speckled white highlight. And with a bit more work, we have something that looks like a stem. If you're not entirely satisfied with the shape of an object, you can turn off Preserve Transparency and select Distorto. I'll reset this brush and use it to reshape the stem and enhance its form. When you do this, you may see some white fringe appear along the edges. If this happens, set your layer to Gel Cover. In order to make the apple look less like plastic, I'll need to add the illusion of texture. I'll use Select Layer Content to get a selection of the apple. Then I'll create a new layer called Texture Dark. I'll change the composite method to multiply since I know this is going to be darker. Then I'll select the Dab Texture airbrush and scale the cloud's flow map larger. Then I'll use a dark red to cover the apple. I'll scale my flow map smaller and paint another pass over the apple. Then I will create another layer called Texture Light, set it to Screen, and I will use a brighter red and yellow to add more detail to the apple. I can reduce the opacity of these layers to blend them in. I'll create one more multiply layer called Texture Fine, and I will use the Sponge G brush to paint a finer texture over the apple by sampling colors that I have already put down. I'll reduce the opacity of that layer to blend it in as well. I might also return to the color layer and add in more yellow at the top of the apple to vary the color a bit more. Next, we'll blend that texture to make it fit the contour of the apple. I'll merge the texture and color layers together with the apple layer so I can blend everything together. Before you do that, you may want to save a copy of your composition with the layers. I'll use the Smooth Knife blender for a smooth acrylic or oil look. I'm blending lightly while following the contours of the apple. Now the texture isn't so uniform and it looks a little more natural. Be careful not to pull the highlights into the shadow zones and vice versa. I can even use the smooth palette knife to blend in some other colors. I'll enhance the brighter spot in the top left. Now let's add a layer of yellow speckles above the apple layer. I'll create a new layer and set the composite method to screen. I'll select the pepper spray brush and I'll paint with a medium yellow color over the apple. I'm using a big brush and I'm clicking with my mouse to make it build up slowly. I'll increase that to 4 and then 8 to create a few larger speckles. I'll select the digital airbrush and I'll give some of the larger speckles a glowing edge. It almost looks like stars. I'll lower the opacity of the layer to 70%, and then I'll use the bulge brush to bulge the speckles from the center of the apple outward to make them match the contours. I'll merge the speckles with the apple layer and then use diffuse blur to pull in the direction of the contour to reshape the speckles. Now that I'm done with the selection, I'll deselect it. Edges and objects that are moving away from you in three-dimensional space should get softer. So now that I'm getting near the end of the painting, I can begin to soften the edges of the apple and stem. With preserve transparency disabled, I'm going to use the blur brush along the edges to make them look out of focus. This is a creative choice. You could have the edge remain sharp, or if you wanted a more painterly edge, you can use the Smooth Knife blender or any of the other blenders. At this point, I'm pretty happy with the apple overall, so I just need to add the finishing touches. I think I'll add a little bit more yellow to the dented area using the smooth palette knife. Then I'll blend that in with the Smooth Knife blender. I'll also add a layer mask to the highlight layer and use the glazing chalk brush with the simulated wood grain paper to mask the edges of the highlight to give it texture. I think that looks pretty good, so I will merge the highlight with the apple and lightly blend it with diffuse blur. I'll disable preserve transparency and blend the reflection layer with coarse oily blender and then use Distorto to clean it up. I think the apple could use a few more yellow speckles that are larger, so I'll add in some of those and then merge and blend them with the apple layer. I'll also merge and blend the reflection. As a final correction, I will add a few darker red spots on the shadow side of the apple that more closely match the darkness in the stem shadow. I can add more dark contrast here and there as well. I'll blend that with coarse oily blender and speckle diffuse blur, and then use a mask to fade it a bit on the light side of the shadow. I'll reduce the opacity a bit. I could keep rendering this to add more detail and realism. This is where you can take your time and add as much detail as you like. Let's finish up this painting by deleting the gray background and sketches and adding a signature. I'll put my initials on a separate layer, and with that, we have a finished painting. If you enjoyed this lesson, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more Corel Painter tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.